Hello and welcome to Unnamed Fitness Podcast. I am your host, Ryan Sullivan.
And I am your other host, Megan Markowitz. And we are going to talk about all the different movement patterns today.
So, what do we mean by movement patterns?
How humans have evolutionarily been moving, and then how humans have changed it and decided how we move.
Yeah, and we decided how we move somewhere around the Industrial Revolution. So so we're talking about evolutionarily prioritized movement versus the modern fitness construct of movement. So I'll explain what that means.
And before we get started, real quick, let's address a comment that we will be trying to come up with another name for this podcast.
At some point in time. Yes, we're working on that.
Suggestions, go ahead and put them in the comments below. We will take them. We've had multiple different names. The fitness industry is, how should we put it, saturated at this moment with every single buzzword you can ever think of. So
if anybody has any fresh ideas, let us know, because we're having a hard time finding something that is not vehemently taken. Evolutionarily prioritized movement patterns versus like the fitness paradigm of movement patterns. Like right now, I don't know if you've seen this on Instagram. I see this meme going around where it's a scene from like the Zorro movie where one guy's swinging a sword around and the other guy just slaps the sword out of his hand. And it's become this thing where everybody kind of gets in their little corner where they're like, cold baths and collagen milk and cupping and scraping and mobility, and then it'll be the thing that they believe in will be on the other side, and it'll be like lifting heavy, getting sleep, having lots of sex, and eating lots of meat. It'll say something like that, and it'll be like, oh, okay. I don't know if that's going to work for everybody, but you apparently think that it does because it works for you. And this is what's really interesting, is that if we look at humans from an evolutionary perspective, not from a marketing perspective, humans have evolved to do a couple of things really, really well. In fact, we're remarkably efficient. I'd like to take 1 second as to why fascia is important in this perspective.
Okay, and before you come to that, make sure let's explain what fascia is for those who might not.
So fascia is the connective tissue that holds your body together. In fact, there is no beginning and there is no end to it. It is essentially around everything that most people talk about. Fascia surrounds that.
Muscles, bones, organs, all that stuff. So like it's in between all of that in it, and it does affect it and play a role in how it moves, doesn't move, that kind of stuff.
In fact, there is literally a fascial scaffolding for your brain. Just like we say, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's even in your bones. So fascia, what's fascinating about fascia is fascia provides support, it provides elasticity, and it provides rigidity to the body and structure at zero caloric cost. Think about that.
I didn't know that, actually.
So if I use a muscle to move something, there's caloric cost. But believe it or not, if my fascia is organized properly, my muscles can minimally engage because the fascia is actually supporting the majority of the structure at minimal engagement of the musculature. If the fascia is injured, the muscles in that region will hyperfacilitate in order to stabilize the area because the fascia can no longer do it. So a lot of the time when you see people with movement patterns that are not ideal, it can often have something to do with poor functioning or injury of the soft tissue, collagen structures like fascia.
So when you say fascia gets injured or damaged, what does that look like? How would you explain that?
It's the same as like tearing fabric. It's not actually a muscular injury. This is what's so interesting about fascial injuries. And the way that they mend themselves is by bringing in more fascia. And what most of us call that is scar tissue.
Scar tissue, there we go. So if you've had a surgery, if you have had an injury and it like healed up, that would all be
C-sections.
C-sections. Yep. Oh yeah.
Yep.
That's all damaged or
Fascia.
fascia. Yep. Okay.
Yep. 100%.
But that is a thing.
Back injuries. If you've ever had a ligament injury in your back, which a lot of people don't even know if they've had one, it typically would still end in a prolapsed disc, and you would never know that there was a ligament injury. But like, for example, I took a hard impact to the head when I was about 20, and this side of my neck is just always tighter, and it's because whiplash is a form of soft tissue or fascial injury to the neck.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be an example.
Do you remember our client, well, my client and a client you've worked with also, who had heart surgery,
Mm-hmm.
and the impact that it played in the lungs, or around the area of the lungs and the diaphragm?
Mm-hmm.
And when you worked with him, you were able to kind of open that up a little bit. I forget the details.
Yeah, I was working with him. So he was your client, but he came to me for manual manipulation stuff. And that was how that worked, which I typically do through a series of tool assisted functions and movement based stuff. And that sort of thing, which you've also like kind of witnessed and learned about that same stuff from me. So the evolutionarily prioritized movements that humans do best are essentially stand, lay, sit, walk, jog, run, climb, carry, push, pull, and throw. That's really what humans do well. In fact, a lot of people say your thumbs are what make people stand out and make us human. Squirrels have thumbs. Thumbs are not unique in nature to humans, but the capacity to throw is uniquely human. We are better throwers than anything else in nature. We are so good at throwing, we have thrown things into orbit. We are that good at it. We are remarkable. And a lot of our brain structure, even, there's a belief that our ability to say, okay, there's a rabbit there, I have a rock. If that rabbit runs that way, I will be able to throw the rock at this point in space, even though the rabbit's over there, and I will be able to meet that rabbit in space. Our ability to project into the future, they believe that is kind of there are theories that say that is at the heart of human consciousness, is that the ability to project into the future through the action of throwing ultimately led to essentially our ability to plan for our 60s. Like that was our baby step evolutionary trait that kind of got us there.
I feel like that's a pretty solid argument to play football.
Oh, for sure. Throwing is, I mean, one of the most
what you just described, like being as a quarterback, being able to like throw the ball and then know where it's going to land in space, in a projection manner.
Right. And that's why so many sports throughout history have involved what? Two things?
Yeah. Throwing,
running,
catching,
and throwing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Like they're just inherently natural to humans. Even in play, it's just inherently natural to us.
Like I think about whenever I'm around like my friends who have toddlers, I have a lot of energy, and so I like to play, and like it's always like the balls. They're always like, grab the ball, throw the ball. Yeah,
exactly.
Catch, grab, like run, like but it comes so naturally.
Yeah, and you see them, and you think about how often as they age, that all of a sudden becomes socially inappropriate. Oh no, we don't do that now.
Yeah,
but throwing is a super common thing. And so when I talk about pushing and pulling, I don't mean push-ups and deadlifts. I mean pushing and pulling carts. I mean pushing and pulling loads. I mean pushing and pulling people. If you take climbing and crawling, and you take pushing and pulling, and you put the two together, you have wrestling. If you take throwing and turn and weaponize that, you have punching and kicking. Essentially, like our core mechanisms are built around those things. And not only that, we go through brain structure development phases in the climbing, crawling phase that actually affect things like reading later in life, language processing, artistic and creative development. And when we look at adults that have back pain or neuromuscular disorders, you'll notice a lot of the corrective exercises look a whole lot like crawling.
So is there a correlation in those studies in if you are able to, or if you do some of those actions, it affects how you then think about cognitive things? Okay. So
Yeah.
It's funny because I started this course, this leadership training course, and we talked about posture and how it changes your mood. And there's a whole TED talk that we watched that was about how even 2 minutes of changing your posture will affect how you act. So like the study that they did in this TED talk was like, you're going to do a power pose. And so if you did a power pose, it was like this, or like hands up, or like lean back, 2 minutes you had to stay in that pose. Then they asked the participants if they wanted to gamble. And so if you did the power pose, there was a group who did the power pose, and there was a group that was like closed in, like shoulders were down, like leaned over, like more inclused. Is that the right term? Like together. And ask the same people if they want to gamble. And it was like a very dramatic difference between like who decided to gamble and who didn't. And obviously the people who were in the power pose were feeling good, they're like, yeah, let's go, versus the people who were down. And so the correlation between how you actually move your body will affect how your brain works in like the cyclical cycle that we've been talking about, where like your body will give you information and you moving your body will give information to your brain and how to act.
100%. It also, and this idea that the brain is the center of everything is just fundamentally not true. The brain is an organ in the body that regulates a whole system. The body, in my view, and of the human movement method view, is that the body is a series of interconnected loops. And that if one loop is affected, all loops are affected. It's just where and when each loop starts becoming aberrantly affected, eventually one of them will break down. And that's where we start to see things like back problems. That's where we see knee problems. That's where we see inflammation disorders. That's where we see, and obviously the foreign things entering the body that shouldn't be there are obviously going to cause this. So the FDA just outlawed red dye number 3 or whatever, or 5, I don't remember which one it is, but like that would be an example of something that is negatively affecting health. If you were bit by a tick and you can be bit by a tick and become allergic to red meat. There's a type of disease out there where if a tick bites you, you can become allergic to red meat. Like we can be affected by things entering our body or affecting our body in such a way that those loops are affected. But if, for example, the environment and the food that we eat and this and that, and there's all these compounding effects on those loops, it's going to accelerate that faster. And that's what most people today are calling aging. And you see there's all this study going into the research of longevity. And yet at the same time, everyone agrees that you need to strength train. But then when you go to strength train, I don't know. So from the human movement perspective and from my perspective, axial loading, putting the spine under heavy compression, isn't really good for the spine long term. If you look into this, so on my YouTube channel, I have a section about spinal engine mechanics. And spinal engine mechanics are a very real thing. They're very much proven. And they explain why there are people out there that cannot bear axial load. And it has to do with the fact that they most likely have suffered fascial injuries, and their spine can no longer maintain itself. And the argument of the creator of the spinal engine theory basically says the human spine was never meant to maintain static high loads. It was never built that way. It's an elastic engine. It's not designed to be axially compressed. Now, does that produce large muscle growth? Yes, scientifically, it absolutely does. And do we need muscle to age well? Yes. But what if we didn't have to do it that way and we could put less shearing force on our joints and actually get the benefits of movement instead of a constant state of breakdown and then healing where it's a constant like this, instead of looking for a constant like this. And for some of us that have already been ground down to a paste, something that looks like this.
Yes. I am laughing a little bit because I feel like you just threw major shots at people casually with the aging comment. But I agree. And I think that a lot of times it happens so often that we think it's normal and we think that it's just part of the process. And it's not. It doesn't have to be. It does not have to be.
No.
But a sedentary lifestyle, like when you are surrounded by that, you think that is part of just the process that our body goes through, where it's, if you, like, I was explaining this to somebody where I was like, if you right now, whatever age you're at, you start moving, okay? Well, actually, let's take it back. Let's take it back to like, okay, you're 20 years old and you're like in a rhythm where you work out routinely, you do mobility exercises, you take care of your body, you restore, you keep going. It's a lot easier for you to keep going on that path because you're going up each time, incrementally small, but you're still going up, right? In terms of your strength, your stability, your mobility, all of that stuff. But if you have not done that and then you hop back in, that is where that a very high like adaptation is going to start taking place. And when the things you're talking about, where you're putting all this extra load that your body was not used to, it was not set up, it was not prepped, it was given no warning to even start some of these exercises. And why, like, it seems like such a big jump for people to hop back in, because all you, like, the small incremental routine does play a role, and it's significant. It's a significant thing.
Well, and believe it or not, so like almost a quarter of the population is in chronic pain. I read a statistic that said 80% of adults in America will eventually experience prolonged back pain. If you are a person on the neurodiverse spectrum, you naturally come with neuromuscular disorders. If you have PTSD and have been diagnosed with PTSD, if you read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, they talk about how people's coordination and balance are highly affected, which would also, that author was not a kinesiologist, so they weren't looking at it through that lens, but that's neuromuscular in nature, or proprioceptive in nature, which leads to neuromuscular. So there's, and anytime we're talking about neuromuscular facilitation, what we're talking about is how the nervous system has its feedback loop with the muscular system. So when the muscle flexes, it's not a one-way signal, it's a constant loop.
Yes.
And if that loop is interrupted or that loop is inaccurate, then you're going to not say, and then we dump 300 pounds on your back. Well, if your spine already kind of is curved, it's just going to get more curved. And there's this attitude, and I was definitely in this camp in my early career with, well, just get stronger. All you got to do is get stronger. But what happens is, if you just get stronger in the standard, and by the way, the standard mode is deadlift, squat, bench, overhead press, chest pull, overhead pull, and then essentially plank twist. Because plank and twist are now the functional movements. We're functional now, plank and twist. So,
okay, real quick.
That's their model.
Yeah, real quick, just to explain that. So like what Ryan's talking about is that, like, when you talk about standard fitness, they're just standard fitness, those are the metrics of which most people will measure your strength and your capacity, for the lack of a better term. And what we're saying is that those, well, from my perspective, like, people made those up. Like, people made up those movements. And if you think about sports, like you think about any kind of like Olympic lifting, CrossFit games, any of that stuff, these are movements that people made up and determined would be a metric. Okay. This wasn't like, oh, we noticed that a lot of people move this way. Like, how often do you snatch something? Like, you take something straight from the ground and whip it all the way up over your head. You might lift something over your head. You might pull something from the ground. You might, and then push it up, but you're never all the way up most of the time, I would say.
Well, and the reason for this is that if you go back to early days of lifting, most people were lifting single-handed. So it wasn't double-handed lifts.
Yeah.
And barbells didn't exist in the early days of strength training. Sure, you'd hoist a rock, and by hoisting is to pick it up from the ground and roll it over your shoulder. Like, which is actually, that's a version of throwing. But when you have a barbell, what's interesting about a barbell is it takes one plane of motion out of the stabilization process. So you can overload the other planes because you artificially have one plane of motion stabilized.
Oh, interesting. I never thought about it. I'm sure you've said this, but I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, that's what makes that's why you can lift so much heavier with a barbell than you can with a dumbbell. And that's why when you get on a machine, you can lift even heavier, because so many different things have been taken out of the equation that you can just overload that joint. And
he's talking about can you talk about the planes real quick though, before going on?
Yeah, so you have multiple planes of motion. It's basically forward, backward, side to side, and then rotation, and then quadrant that out from the body. So you have upper, lower, basically.
Either going from like side to side, going front to back, or you incorporate all
in what's called the transverse plane. And so the idea, I once read a book when I was in martial arts that I absolutely fell in love with and completely affected my view of human movement. It's called The Dynamic Sphere, and it's actually about judo. And it's about how the human body moves and how the human body generates power and efficiency. And judo and sumo are really good examples of sports. Sorry, I lost you for a second.
Yep. You froze for a second. I don't know who it was.
Yeah. Judo and sumo are really good examples of sports where the people actually take really good care of their fascial networks and they utilize them heavily. Same thing with actually kettlebells, very fascially oriented. Olympic lifting, one of the hardest things about Olympic lifting, particularly when you do the clean and jerk, is that you take a split stance. And when you take that split stance, you're going to wind up with natural asymmetry in the hips. And that's going to lead to curvature in the spine. And that's ultimately going to lead to a shoulder injury first. And you see it all the time. And it's one of those things where I'm not saying people shouldn't do these sports. I'm saying that the problem is that we as an industry and as a society, particularly in America, we idolize the 1% of success and believe that if I get up and brush my teeth at 4:30 in the morning, just like Steve Jobs did, that means I'm going to be a billionaire. And those things may correlate, but they are not causal. And just because there are certain people that look a certain way that go to the very, very highest levels of performance, that might be corollary, but it is not causal. And the problem is we have these bodies of existing subjects that are really easy to study. So we say, well, the science said that in order to get more maximum leg facilitated power, I need to squat heavy at these numbers. And that might be true for the people that have unremarkable spines.
Mm-hmm.
But seeing as how at least 1 in 4 people are walking around with a spinal deformity, not to mention neuromuscular disorders, collagen disorders, or anything else that I've already listed. Basically, what I'm saying is that what we associate these things as being causal, and they're not causal, they're correlative at best. But one thing that we do know is that walking is good for you lifelong. We know that strength training is good for you lifelong. We know that you should keep and maintain musculature lifelong, but that does not necessarily mean that bodybuilding is the best path to long-term good biomechanics that are going to save my joints and my spine, and not even that, but help my nervous system.
Yes, I think that we also, at least in America and society, we praise those who go to those extremes. That is deemed successful, where what you're talking about, we're talking about here is like, this is a balanced approach to training that you will be able to continue doing long term. And that doesn't sound as sexy. It just doesn't.
No, it doesn't.
Cool. It doesn't sound as, but guess what? You know what's really cool is not having back pain, not being able to get to your next workout. Like,
well, the fitness industry just accepts that you're training, and then when you get injured, you go into PT or surgery or cortisone shots or whatever, and then you go through your cycle, and then you either go back into training or you're a loser. And that's kind of like when you get on Instagram and you read the memes and you see the bro science. I don't care how altruistic they sound. I promise you, a lot of what people now seem to think is high level performance is medically induced. And in many cases, there are people that have extreme genetics that do allow them to carry significantly more muscle than other people. I was not so genetically gifted in my life. I just wasn't. Even at the largest that I ever was, I was probably 25% body fat in order to put on the amount of muscle I needed to be the strength I needed to be. And I was not a healthy size. I was not comfortable. I looked back at my medical records back then. I'm in way better health now. And
what do you look at? What kind of standards, or like what?
Just like my triglycerides, my HDL, my LDL, my blood pressure, my heart rate, my resting heart. I've always had a low resting heart rate, but I've always been very active. And so it's it's one of those things where and also compositionally, I'm better off today than I was then, and I'm still well within what is considered a healthy BMI. And I know right now it's fashionable to say, well, BMI is BS.
Yeah.
And I mean, yes, that's true in certain cases. And if you're in Europe, which I am currently, you notice that there's a lot more pressure on health and wellness than there is on these extreme aesthetics. Now, those fitness standards have a foothold here. You definitely see that. But most people just want to be healthy lifelong. And they are really interested in being healthy lifelong. And I would say the vast majority of the population is actually really turned off by the bro culture and the gym rat culture and all of that. And it's an icky vibe for them. And I don't blame them. It's gotten old as I've aged. I was totally a part of it once, but it's gotten old as I've aged, for sure.
I also think that it doesn't offer like a safe environment for some people who have certain things that are going on that do prevent them from being a strict bro in less capacity. So that plays a role in it too. I have had people say to me that like, I train people in like a private studio, and like that is a reason that some people want to train, is because they want to be in a private, because they don't want to be at the gym where that culture is more present.
Right. Yeah. And having worked in gyms for years and martial arts studios for years, like I've worked in some pretty, I'm going to say, intense environments. And I've created some pretty intense environments. Again, it served my need at the time, but looking back on it, if I were to do it all over again, I knew what I knew now, a very common thing to be said. But if I found me back then, that's what I would have been looking for. Yeah. And so, they talk about being the change you want to see in the world. And that's the thing is, I know that we don't have a ton of followers of our podcast strictly and everything, but I do think that if there are people out there that would like an alternative to that standard and would like something that is safe and effective and useful, then this is a really good place to start. They can go to the YouTube channel, they can go to the Instagrams, they can follow us, they can start to look for, chronic pain populations that exercise and things like that, because it's a different mentality, it's a different practice, and it's much more about lifelong and holistic health and wellness, a more integrated approach, not just in the moment, but in the long term.
And it also incorporates different pieces of your life that play a dramatic role in your fitness, whether you want to acknowledge it or not.
Yeah, totally. So we're going to dive more into this in the future. If there's specific topics that came up in this and you guys would like to learn more, leave it, like, subscribe, leave comments below, and we will be back next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.